the vaccines are.
Got it.
So I'll introduce myself first and throw over to you.
Love it.
I need to mute this because I'm getting the feedback again. But anyway, hello everyone. My name is Craig Savage. I assume you know because you're on my channel. And I'm being reminded that the lag between Zoom and YouTube is substantial and annoying. I'm an independent data consultant, and once again, I am joined by Jahan to talk about predicted versus actual, more specifically with respect to some government modeling. Jahan?
Yeah, my name is Jahan. I am a product manager, but I used to be a data analyst. So I've got a lingering and far-reaching interest in data science and analytics. So yeah, you just can't keep me away from it.
Yeah, it's a little odd to call it lingering based on the current discussions, but yeah.
Yes, it's more than lingering.
It's kind of like that, isn't it? So last time we talked a little bit about the Doherty modeling that the Australian government commissioned to provide recommendations for reopening and stopping lockdowns. And congratulations to my colleagues in New South Wales for hitting 70% fully jabbed. We are probably, 70%, right?
70%, yeah.
Yeah, we're probably 2 or 3 weeks behind you, unfortunately. So we get to endure that a bit longer. But in doing so, Victoria has said that it's kind of good in a way, not because lockdown is better, but because we'll get to see what happens in New South Wales. That as restrictions are lifted, whether or not we get an explosion of cases, how good is the modeling we've done so far, we being Australia. And in particular, the Doherty modeling was at a national level, whereas in Victoria, they commissioned modeling from Burnett. And so today we want to talk about predicted versus actual, because at the end of the day, that's kind of the name of the game. And oftentimes people talk about which model is better or right. I'm a big fan of the saying, all models are wrong, some models are useful.
Yeah.
But then which one is more useful? Do you have any thoughts on
that? Which model is more useful? I generally speaking about which models are more useful, I think models that answer whatever it is whatever question it is you're trying to answer or whatever problem you're trying to solve, that's the best model. It doesn't have to necessarily be the most robust. Examples, not famous, but examples I always hear about are segmentations where business rules often beats algorithmic segmentation because often you get these data clusters that are kind of interesting and nice and mathematically more elegant, but far, utterly useless. So in that case, it's a model that is both wrong and useless, which is not the type of model you want. So yeah, I think that's really what makes the model valuable and useful.
Yeah, and when we look at these two models versus kind of public perception of what numbers that are being reported, I've seen a number of dashboards. You mentioned one on Reddit, is that right?
Yeah. There's one Redditor that posts a lot. I can't remember his name, but yeah, he posts. It's very simple forecasting, I think. And I think he just reruns it every day and then just uploads it, and you get these nice little plots that just give you a sense of where things might be going.
Yep. So there are forecasts there?
Yes, there is a forecast. So I think, and it takes into account, I think, the impact of vaccination and stuff like that.
Right.
So it seems relatively robust, or at least there's some thinking there as to what's happening rather than just linear trend. Go.
Yeah. Do you know if the observations are plotted alongside the forecast, or is the forecast being recomputed every day?
Forecast is being recomputed every day. So there's no predicted versus actual.
Yeah, and so this is, again, one of the drawbacks I see in a lot of modeling, not just for this, but in general in business, that you'll have a model, you'll get a prediction, and then based on the modeling, we're going to do this. But in retail applications, for instance, if your current click rate is 2%, and with smarter targeting of your customers, you might want to push that up to 4%. but whether or not it actually has sometimes goes by the wayside. Have you seen things like that?
As in like models with like trivial effects or essentially no real effect, and they never actually bother to really properly test it and kind of confuse.
Or it was tested very much in the kind of training test validation phase and the construction of the model. But then great things are promised and maybe they don't actually arrive.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that. I've seen models that were, the only real experience I have with actual models that go to production was the recommender system. That was kind of done as it was kind of treated as like a classification problem, which was probably not the best way to have done it. There was previous behavior, so this is what people typically preferred. The challenge there was, well, what is what people need? Because what they were recommended in the past was good at that point. It's not good now. So it's not the same as having actual clicks versus, do they click on it or do they not? We're trying to get people to click on it, but we're not necessarily sure about what we're not necessarily sure what success looks like, because it was just a bit more ambiguous. But yeah, I think that it often is missing. I think quite often you could pretty much get away with just training a model and then just presenting it back, and people would think you're amazing, unless you had an analyst in there who'd ask if you maybe had a validation or test set in there. But then afterwards, people just kind of move on.
Yeah, and I want to, taking that people do often move on, talking again about the current situation and the evolving situation between New South Wales and Victoria. What are some metrics that you're seeing that predicted versus actual comes relevant?
Well, I'd say there's three metrics, which is just daily cases, daily hospitalizations, and daily deaths. I think those are the numbers to check. I think the current, all the modeling we've seen expects a massive increase in cases, and ideally like a massive increase in cases, a moderate increase in hospitalizations, well, relative to cases, and a fairly small increase in deaths, which over a period of time will, amount to a few thousand, but won't be, thousands per week. Yep.
So I'm going to start with cases or new infections, and we spoke about this last time, and you expressed some concern about the scales being a bit different. But if I just go to share my screen here, which is why we're doing this on YouTube and not just a podcast. Here we have, this is from the Doherty report, and it's for the all-adult strategy, different levels of vaccine coverage, assuming that we stop at 70%, or sorry, at 80%. And it says note the different y-axes, which is why I'll put up with it, but here it becomes a little bit more relevant because in Victoria, now this is national, not Victorian, but we're somewhere between 70 and 80%. In Victoria single dose. Congratulations for hitting it in New South Wales. So expecting those two graphs at the bottom, New South Wales to be somewhere in between there. How would you think about tracking this with watching your new infections per day, having hit that 70% threshold?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pity we don't have like a nice, CSV file that's just, day one number of cases, having a range maybe for each one, so that we could see whether it falls within the range. But I mean, essentially, what we're looking at, if you were to predict this here, you'd say day 0 would be basically Monday on the bottom left. And then from there, you'd expect 3 months from today for there to be a very slow uptick in cases. And then it would continue on from there. The challenge, though, is that we're currently in the several hundred cases already. So I've heard from people who did this modeling, or who are working with the people who did this modeling, that it's fine, that it essentially doesn't matter if we start with 10,000 cases a day, 1,000 or 1 case per day. This modeling, these conclusions will still hold true, but I don't quite understand, because it seems like it slowly builds over time as the virus kind of spreads across the community over 90 days. And then in the following 90 days, it kind of starts to kind of balloon out. So predicted versus actual here is a little bit hard because we're not starting from the same place. So if we were to just, at a y-intercept and just kind of push everything up a bit, or an x-intercept, sorry, and push everything up,
Right.
and start at 500 and then expect it to stay flat for 90 days.
Mhm.
Maybe, but even just that doesn't even pass the sniff test to me. I just don't think that's the way things are going to play out. I think we'll get a much earlier spike.
Okay.
What do
Yeah,
you
but
think?
it's an interesting thing that you want to touch on, because there is this uncertainty as to how much this would move if we started at, what are you at now? 500 cases a day,
Yeah,
700
it's
cases a day,
565. I think it was today. I think ish.
right? Versus the uncertainty, which is illustrated in the graph with your error bars, if you will. The kind of most likely region being the darker one, and then the lighter regions around it. So there's the two sources of uncertainty: the kind of known uncertainty, or the statistical uncertainty, versus the parameter or model assumption uncertainty, that we're not starting from 0 cases. It's kind of almost an advantage with this y-axis, that 500 relative to 40,000 is basically 0.
Yes, yes.
So
I was looking at that afterwards. I was thinking, yeah,
it's a little bit better, but not necessarily for the right reasons.
Absolutely.
But it would be nice if, again, starting from Monday, they put in the first X at 500 cases or whatever it will be on Monday, and then started putting little X's alongside this graph. And then to follow up with whether or not the 80% is hit at the same, at the predicted time here about 2 weeks later, or if it's later, if this graph could be regenerated, because I think currently New South Wales is at 90% single dose.
Single dose, I think so. Yeah.
And single dose being a predictor for people who are willing and able to get the second dose, there might be a 90% line.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that'd be very, very useful. I think the challenge, though, is if you look at a lot of the conversation going on now, people talking about opening up, and Victoria's talking about seeing if there is a spike. You mentioned it, and I don't know if this was your phrasing or your paraphrasing, seeing if there's an increase in cases or a spike in cases. And the answer is kind of, it seems like it's an interesting way of phrasing it, because there will be a huge spike in cases, of course.
Right.
Like that's expected. It's just that we're not talking about how much. So I think what you're talking about is taking it to the next level of maturity, or several steps ahead, which is not just how much, but how much do we expect?
Right.
It's the difference between, like, I hope we don't get many cases, to I know we'll get cases, but here's what we'll be actually worried.
Yeah. And I think starting off with that single metric of the only thing I'm going to track is cases per day, which is I don't know, it's been the focus in the media here, at least in my opinion, more so than deaths per day or ICU admittances. You see them all, but I think the big number is cases per day, and that's the one everyone tends to, even though as you mentioned, it's not the only one that matters. ICU and deaths, in my opinion, are more important. And the only reason to track cases per day is because it's a leading indicator for ICU and death. Absolutely.
Not to mention having a case fatality rate. That's super important. So the relationships between those three key kind of counts.
Yeah, and the image I showed was from Doherty, talking about different vaccine levels. It's a slight different presentation if I talk about the Burnett modeling, which again is Victoria specific. But if I share that with you, it's organized a bit differently, although there are several commonalities that I want to kind of address and get your opinions on, and the opinion of kind of communicating, because while we might have different opinions of this presentation relative to the Doherty modeling, the definition here is more specific. For this Burnett modeling, this is Victorian specific. It was based on the Victorian roadmap. So the Doherty modeling was, here's some different scenarios, now pick a roadmap. This is different because it's, here's what we currently have. This is what the current roadmap is projected to be. These are the results. So even starting off with that different problem statement, if you will, can inform your models, can inform your results. And accordingly can inform the visualizations, because now they're saying, right, we're going to start reopening at 70% and reopen more at 80%.
Interesting, because this one here though, because I look at it now, we're at October 7th and it's already expecting to see a massive increase in cases. What do you know what's behind that? Is that just simply just extrapolation from that period of time where they expected it to continue to rise because it was essentially rising, which it largely has. We've just been slightly on the lower end of that, right? With 1700. Right. Yeah.
And this is something that's been reported in the press here, is today I think we had 1,700 cases. Well, in October around here, that's within kind of this band of uncertainty. So it gets reported of, well, we had 1,700, but it's meant to peak in like October. It's meant to peak around 3,000 cases a day, even before we hit our 70% threshold and start to reopen.
Yeah. Interesting.
Some of the similarities here, we once again have the different shading. Here, the median is traced out a bit harder, and you can see there's a lot of kind of upside risk and not so much lower side risk. That said, it could be worse and it could be a lot worse, but there's no prediction that says, and then everything magically goes away in November. The lower limit's quite firm, if you will. You were going to say?
I said when you say the low limit's quite firm, as in like there's always still going to be cases in even the best case scenarios, is what you're saying.
Like, right. Even under this, under the given the parameters, with the fixed parameters, the natural variation we expect to see is still around, I don't know, what is this, 500 cases a day? 1,000 cases a day?
Yeah.
Because the worst case scenario can hit, 10,000 cases per day.
I will jump in straight away and say, like, I think the data visualization here is just far superior to the other paper. It's so much, it's telling you daily cases, hospitalization, ICU demand, and cumulative deaths. So they've broken down hospitalizations into serious ones and just all hospitalizations. So you get a bit of a funnel view. What's also great is it's all done in a similar, different axes once again, but here I'm more okay with that simply because it's kind of understood. We're looking at very different metrics, so we'd expect them to be on a different scale. So I don't feel so cheated, although I could also see why some people might be confused. And then in terms of just what you're seeing here, it's the whole message. You can see essentially it starts at one point, it makes predictions, and you can much more easily just trace this against what actually happened. And the most interesting thing here is the cumulative deaths, where you still see by January, deaths are on the rise. They're expecting to see a couple of thousand, maybe 2,500.
Yeah.
And
that's cumulative, of course, not daily.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, but that's the total death. Yeah. It hasn't quite fully reached its peak. It's reached its peak, but it hasn't fully died down. So that's interesting. It's kind of one of those things where you're like, when will it end? At what point will the deaths expected to stop? Which makes me wonder why if they could have done a little bit gone a bit further out. But that said, I also get it, because the further you go out in time, the harder it is to predict. So I think this is really, really good. And this is actually, if anything, it makes me feel a lot more comfortable with what's going to happen with the future here, because it looks like worst case scenario based on this model, it's going to be kind of 5,000 total deaths to January, and then probably it'll slow down at that point. So we're looking at less than 10,000 deaths, most likely, which is so much below America and other places, in the UK.
Yes, but remember, this is Victoria.
Yeah, so, just Victoria.
Right. So I should 6 million people versus 26 million people is, quite a big scale difference, which again is part of the reason why these graphs are going to look fundamentally different in terms of the numbers relative to the Australia only.
Yeah. No, that's totally true. I think the thing I like though is seeing the whole picture in one little place, and it doesn't. I don't have to cycle through or stick around too much.
And as we I would really like to see this graph of little, as I said, little dots or little X's appearing. You may need to scale this down so that you can see, especially relative to the national numbers. When you're at 40,000, it's a little harder to see. I don't know if you can make this a log scale, but what do you think about showing this to the general public? Do you think the general public is comfortable with confidence intervals? And, you know, if the general public or even some of your managers, if you said, right, new diagnoses around Christmas time, we expect to be somewhere between 1,000 cases a day and 10,000 cases a day. Do you think they just laugh you off, or do you think you could make a case for there's this much uncertainty, and so we need to be careful?
Yeah, like I've always found in presenting business cases, people wanted best case, worst case, and expected case, because they didn't want to know about the whole distribution of plausible values. They just wanted to get like a floor, you know, a midpoint and a ceiling. I think that might, I mean, I love this. I look at this and I kind of want everyone to just learn to get it. I want people to figure it out. I kind of think it's kind of like, oh, you can't spell. Well, you know, learn to spell unless you've got like a problem with spelling that's like, you know, it's somehow serious and like hard for you to change. Like, learn, like it's good. Right. But I also am pragmatic in that the messaging needs to be so simple for people to absorb it, both in a state of panic and a state of partial interest. So this should be broadly distributed to the public, but not to like everyone. Not like this shouldn't be the main message. This is for the people who want the detail, which I guess is like 10% of the population.
Right.
What do you think?
I agree with you, and I think that's part of why we're having these sessions, right? So that we can see what's going on here, and we can try to explain to people what's happening. And we can, if I go back to that, I have foolishly changed windows, but there we go. Now I can see again. But I agree with you that learn more and getting people to learn more. I don't know if that works when you have adversarial relationships. And by that, I mean that like the shock jocks and some of the other people who would say, what do you mean you don't know we could have 1,000 cases a day or 10,000 cases a day? There's a factor of 10 there. If I look at the deaths, which as you say is the more important, we could be losing fewer than 1,000 people or 4,000 people. It's like, well, what? How am I supposed to know the difference? How am I supposed to trust this? It's those things that worry me. In addition to the philosophical, asking people to believe that God plays dice and all these things are just random, that we don't know what'll happen, can be a little tricky sometimes.
No, that's very true. I think maybe what could bring this to life as a story. So I think now about just presenting findings like this back to stakeholders that aren't quant inclined. If we have a whole bunch of data from across the world, we have close to 700,000 deaths now, I think, in the US. We have the number in the UK, which I think is like close to 200,000. We could essentially just look at, do a comparison and say, okay, if we were to look at the death rate in America, the rate of spread, and just, make it more comparable, like just scale it down to Australia's population, that is how bad this could be. What is this modeling saying? It's saying it's somewhere between, 5 to 20% of how bad this could be over there. That's good, but it's not great. Like 5% would be great, maybe. If we have 20% of as many deaths, relative to the proportion in the population size.
Yeah, speaking of
not great.
Using data from other places, of course, we do have data about larger numbers of hospitalizations and deaths from other countries. And in particular, the Burnett modeling presents this table, which talks about for different ages, how susceptible are they to the virus? What's the probability they're symptomatic? The little caret by the symptomatic is, this is Victorian data. So of the people who were tested in Victoria, how many of them had symptoms when they got tested versus how many got tested because they went to an exposure site, for instance. But then the single hash is from the Imperial College, which they've scaled up based on Canadian data to say what's the probability of it being severe or critical. And then Knock et al. Is a UK study that says, well, what's the probability that someone's path takes them to hospital or the ICU? And loosely speaking, severe is hospitalization, critical is ICU. They're not exactly the same because we know, of course, some people who pass away do so at home, that they never go to ICU for various reasons. So in that way, the model chain gets broken, that some people die without going to ICU, even though they have critical because it kills them. So looking at these numbers, which are, again, mostly overseas, we have, again, this trade-off between, well, we know there's some randomness picked because if the probability of hospitalization of someone quite old is about 45%, it's roughly a coin flip. And there's a difference between whether or not your coin comes up versus 45% is the wrong number.
Yeah. Interesting. It's interesting, this is like an absolutely fascinating table, and then all the small print at the bottom is where the devil is, right?
Yeah, exactly.
No, interesting. I'm kind of just absorbing it all. What do you make of it? What are your thoughts?
Well, there's a macro and micro view to a lot of it, I think. So for young kids, 0 to 9, the probability of death is what? Not 4 in 10, not 4 in 100, not 4 in 1,000, not 4 in 10,000, but 4 in 100,000. And something that people do is they say, well, that's 0, 4 in 100,000. But then you say, well, there's a few million kids. So we're talking about 30, 50 kids dying, less than 10. And that's what I mean by micro and macro, because for any given kid, the probability that they pass away is small, very small, small enough to, I would argue, kind of fall beneath the human threshold for saying something's possible. But when you scale it times millions of kids, suddenly you're talking about kids dying, and you get that fear, that shock of, but you're saying there's a chance, and my kid, I don't want my kid exposed, right? And so you get that. From a policy perspective, that gets quite difficult. Go ahead.
No, it's just like, and I think it's also then you multiply it by 2 million or something, and it's like, okay, looking at the number of expected cases in the worst case from the previous page you showed me, that's kind of what we want to multiply it by to get the worst case scenario for kids. To be like, okay, what proportion of the total population gets it? The worst case scenario, the probability of being symptomatic is lower, but let's just be pessimistic and assume that they're equally likely to get it. Then how many deaths is that? Probably be quite few, but it'd be highly publicized. I mean, just think about it. And that's where I think the probabilistic nature of this stuff is where people freak out, because there is a possibility that someone who's 30 or 20 who's double vaccinated dies of COVID.
That's right.
And that's where the law of large numbers can confuse people, because they don't realize that, well, I mean, it's also possible for a 40-year-old person to get Alzheimer's, but
that's right.
We probably shouldn't, have a charity specifically for that case.
That's right. And all this is for vaccinated. They have similar totals for vaccinated, as soon as I can find that window, which basically says you take these numbers and you scale them down. And you scale them down in such a way that I look for it and fail to find it. So that's very exciting. Quick, talk, save me.
No. I always find this stuff interesting when there's a gap in the data, where you just have to kind of you might find the scale to multiply it by, but when you scale it all down, it's like there's an element of I'm sure there's an element of nerves as the analysts putting this out there and saying, okay, this is what we believe it is. So I always feel for those people, because when information is missing, you have to kind of make something up based on a best guess. And decision making, incomplete data is hard.
So this is the table of how effective vaccines are. And to your earlier point, when I started looking for this, they're not 100% effective. So this is overall protection versus in the previous, it was by age.
Yeah.
And this is one of the things I wanted to mention when talking about predicted versus actual is your predicted and actual, you should be monitoring at the same kind of granularity that your predictions are.
Yeah, yeah.
So while there's good overall information, the unvaccinated and vaccinated aren't on the same scale, if you will, because that age direction is missing. And while it's not explicitly presented of, well, here's your unvaccinated numbers, when I incorporate these, this is what the vaccinated numbers come to. For the case of kids, it doesn't matter because the vaccine isn't approved. No vaccine is approved for under 10s.
Yeah, yeah.
But if you start looking at, well, now 12-year-olds are getting vaccinated. Let's take that number. If I go back to it, let's take these numbers for 15 to 19, for instance, and multiply that 4 in 100,000 times 90% effective in stopping. So it's now 4 in a million, but as you said, it's still not 0. And especially in the beginning, when there are small numbers of deaths, if one of those deaths is fully vaccinated, in an adversarial situation, will people throw up their hands and say, oh my goodness, look, you're lying to us?
Yeah, and the answer is they absolutely will. Yeah, I mean, I guess the study of statistics is a study of uncertainty, but that's not the way people perceive it. People think the study of statistics is a study of certainty or removing uncertainty rather than quantifying it.
That's
right.
right.
I think that's where everything kind of falls apart. And then people think that things are, rules that apply universally when really it's just probabilistic, probabilistic inferences. So it's a sad time, to be honest. There's some great numbers here. There's some great things that we could be discussing and talking about in more depth. But given the level of quantitative literacy out there, it wouldn't be a productive conversation. It would just confuse people.
Yeah.
Which makes me kind of wonder, like, it would be nice to have these conversations with, to have videos published from these institutes and institutions, etc. To just say this is what they think is going to happen. Like say, like, hey, this is our prediction. Here's how we're tracking. But I think the model that they're engaged by is just more, they provide a report to the government passes it on. I think it'd be better to have those people continue to engage people with what they're doing, and then let the government present the report. And then for the people who are interested in predictive versus actual, they can get it.
Yeah, I also think when you start talking predictive versus actual, there's a mindset change. Yep. Because currently it's in the 24 hours up to now. What happened in the past was, and when you start talking predictions, it gives you a kind of a goal. It gives you some form of normalcy. So looking at lockdown in Victoria, we were told, well, when we hit 70% double vax, we're going to start to get more freedoms. Now, no one knows exactly what day that is, but it's around late October. But once you're told that, and then you can start seeing, well, the number of total vax people is going up and up and up and up and up. And you can see the date getting closer and closer and closer. And you can see that the predictions and the reality aren't that far apart. But it might be a little bit different if they said, well, we expect to have hundreds of cases a day, and then 1,000 cases a day, and then 2,000 cases a day, but then it should turn over. If the day comes where you hit 3,000, it's like, hang on, wait a minute. You said it would stop at 2,000. Like, well, I did say that. Sorry.
Totally. It's the difference between there being like a fixed, this is the number, this is what's going to happen, compared to here's a range, here's a window. Let's see if we, stay within that window, or if we move away from it. If we move away, let's then reassess. It's a very different mentality and much more constructive. Yeah,
and anomalies, if you can explain them, I think are fine. So in Victoria, we had a extra surgeons, more than you might have expected, because the grand final happened. And when they called people and said, hey, you tested positive, tell me more about what you did. They're like, yeah, I went over to my friend's house. We had some beers and watched the game. And they said it was about a third of people that said, yeah, we broke the rules. Sorry.
Oh, wow.
And so in that case, when you get these outliers, it can be quite informative In data, a lot of people try to suppress outliers and try to move them. But if you have this prediction and you get an observation that's outside, it can actually be quite informative and can be quite useful from a data standpoint to say, okay, I see what's happening. Or not I see what's happening, but I see some things happening. Let me find out what it is, because I wouldn't expect to be out. And the same thing could happen on the other side. If you get a very small number of cases, is everyone getting tested? What's going on?
Totally. I think it, especially given the paucity of data, we have a lot of data, but of not of the things that we are worried about. We don't have, it's almost like it's a very imbalanced class problem in many ways. In that the part of the what we're seeing is just lockdown, low case numbers, or case numbers increasing despite lockdown, but not like 10,000 cases a day and we're not doing anything. We only get that from overseas. I can only make assumptions and extrapolate.
Well, we did see last week that the Doherty modeling does still predict R greater than 1 in even a light lockdown at 80%. So we still have these kind of bad news scenarios coming out. And speaking of bad news scenarios coming out from the Burnett overall modeling, which is again informing Victoria. Let's make this a bit bigger so you can see it. Zoom. So once again, the statement here is a little bit different, but in this case, it's closer to the Doherty, where they say, here's cases, hospital, ICU, and deaths for various kind of lockdown restrictions. And the roadmap in
Victoria
red,
or all of Australia?
This is Victoria.
Yeah, cool.
This is Victoria. And contrary to the Doherty table, which I'll show next, this has more information and less information. And by that, I mean, as we were talking about confidence intervals and things like this, in addition to the median forecast, they also have a range. And once again, you get this strange thing of, are we going to have 2,000 hospitalizations or 4,400? Which is important in Victoria, because if we only have 2,500 beds, whether we're over or below that makes a big difference. And here they're predicting from the roadmap, there's a 63% chance we run out of hospital capacity. Any thoughts on these numbers?
I mean, it's just sad, really. I mean, 63% chance, 58% chance of exceeding ICU capacity. That's when people start dying. So I'm assuming that their deaths account for that. Although I don't know, you'd imagine that the uncertainty around deaths would really be around the uncertainty around, like, there's cases where you exceed hospital capacity and then lots of people die, or cases where you don't, and then far fewer people die, because obviously if you get access to a respirator, your likelihood of surviving is much higher. I think this is really good. Like, I mean, sad news, but I think this modeling and the way that they're presenting information is really useful. Interesting things here, like having predicted dates for when they think things are going to really peak. That is very useful, because it really brings it to life. It doesn't just say here's a static forecast, but actually embeds it down to this is when it's going to actually happen, which the Doherty modeling didn't do. And I mean, the Doherty modeling, like we're talking about before, it allows you to do that, but it doesn't explicitly do it itself. I mean, not like it could at the time, but
So I am going to swap over to the Doherty modeling. Speaking of, and make this nice and bigger so that you can hopefully see it. I was going to show the two side by side, but I'm not sure it's easy to read if I do that. Which, again, this is Australia-wide, not Victoria, so the scale of the numbers is quite a bit different. But what I like about this, not in terms of the format, but in my opinion, it has the two big variables presented for breakdown, which is age and vaccination status. If I could get this over time, I'd be happier. And going back to my point about if you're going to build a model and monitor it, you should be on the same kind of frame as when you built it. So when we have numbers reported today, I would love to see it if they reported broken down by age and vaccination status. You can often get it if you read carefully. It'll tell you, or you'll get high level numbers that say, I think in Victoria, most cases were under the age of 50, which I see, and it's like, hooray, they're less likely to die. Great,
Yeah.
that's wonderful. Do they report these types of variables in New South Wales, ages and vaccination status?
I think they have at times, but I can't remember, to be honest. I think it was more locations and vaccination status than anything else. And then I think for some of the older populations that were more vulnerable, it's basically like where are the people who are more vulnerable that are unvaccinated, which is interesting because focusing on the most vulnerable first, according to the Doherty modeling, isn't the best approach. It's about the most mobile.
Yeah,
I mean,
go ahead.
And it's interesting, this like there is a bit more information, but there's also less. Like I find it like the lack of a confidence interval that annoyingly like just have like 5 million, you know, I mean, for the first one, 5.1 million. Right. 5.1 million is fine. It's more readable. Instead, you have this like insane little table. So anyway, I'm more criticizing the readability than anything else.
Yeah, I agree with you that it would be good to have the confidence interval, because okay, is it 8 deaths in 6 million? Is that under 10, or is that somewhere between 2 and 150? Most likely 8. I'm exaggerating because I don't think the high end is that high, but looking at the other plots, the fact that there is that kind of floor in the Burnett modeling versus peaks that can be 10 times as much. This could be 0 or it could be 80 if I apply the same types of scales to it.
Yeah.
Which is very quick, and anyone familiar with this type of modeling is like, no, Craig, you can't just scale it that way. Yes, I know I can't just scale it that way, but how should I scale it? It's hard for me to have an intuition about these numbers when they're so precise, and yet in all the other ones, there's that confidence interval.
Yeah, being overly precise just is never a good idea.
Right, because if we get 9, would we call it a disaster? Which I don't think that would be very fair to go down to the single case or single death level.
Yeah. Oh, it's always I got told off once in a business case for having numbers that were too specific, and they were nowhere near as specific as these, and it's to a much smaller audience. So yeah.
The only time I like to be specific is if it's something like percentages, because if it's something like percentages, I look and I add them all up and I see how close to 100 you are. Because I'm a geek, and I look at the numbers and I'm like, 80, 90, 102. Yeah, that's okay. That's fine. You're at it. 130. I got a question about your percentages.
Every analyst has a story of percentages not summing to 100% due to rounding issues and people freaking out, and you're like, 102% is fine. We've been rounding things for you.
Not as much. 102, fine.
Yeah, I mean 500% is fine if it's not summable. Sure. Yeah, which of these things do you own? You can own all of them.
Yeah. And I've seen problems where people double count. So like even that table, the deaths hopefully were in ICU, which are hopefully hospitalizations, which are hopefully submissions, so that you've quadruple counted a lot of those people, or simulated people, I guess I should say.
Yeah.
In those numbers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I kind of want to finish by putting all these thoughts together, and as a data professional, I don't want to just say, hey, here's a lot of critiques. I like to say, and here's my recommendation, because I honestly believe if you're going to criticize something, be ready to propose and defend an alternative. And what I'd like to see is the numbers broken down a bit more, broken down by age and vaccination status, broken down by based on what we've seen so far. This is how many hospitalizations, deaths we expect to see in the same format as presented by Doherty or Burnett, depending on which model you're presenting, so that as the number of deaths in the unvaccinated population starts ticking up, the unvax, and in particular when children start to die, to say,
Mhm.
yeah, we were unfortunately expecting that. We had, we've hit our 100,000th child. We're expecting 4, unfortunately. So 25,000th child, to see that number tick up and to be like, yeah, we're expecting this to get bad.
Yeah, understood. I totally agree with you. I think you're on the money in terms of wanting to see the detail, wanting to see the prediction against that. So I want to break it down, obviously, wanting to get predicted versus actual. So I don't disagree at all on the what. So I want to more talk about the how, in terms of how they're communicating this and what I'm seeing. If you compare it to the burnout modeling, I think is better in terms of how they tell their story and how they communicate it, and then also how they tie it back to reality. Instead of doing day 0 to day 180, they're this date to that date. Obviously, there's a different context, so there's a reason why that wasn't appropriate with the Doherty modeling. But I think that is one step in the right direction, but you still see this is very antiquated. I mean, what they've got there, apart from the fact it was typed up on a computer and it's a PDF, it could be like a, otherwise done on a typewriter with a few drawings. We're not really making use of technology here. Having a website that just has predicted versus actual and brings this stuff to life, I think, is where this stuff should be. And I think that's where research is really not keeping up with all the advances in technology. They have all the technology in terms of modeling and epidemiological, just statistical knowledge and know-how. I can't speak right now, but they don't have a way of just tracking it and changing the way they approach it to just, here's the paper, now look at it, or here's the report. I've done my work, and to me, I'm like, no, you just started, you just engaged us, you got us interested. We wanted to see where this goes. Now show us the rest of the picture.
Yeah, and I would like to see the Doherty model updated. Now, it's possible that it is, right? I pulled the report for preparation for this. It's entirely possible that there are updates and there are new papers coming. But the fact that I go to the newspaper for good visualizations and data scraping, or sites that, as far as I can tell, are maintained by interested citizens rather than any official government location, is a little disturbing, to be honest.
Yeah.
And for a future video, I went and poked around what data were available from Victoria and New South Wales, and I'm sad to say that New South Wales is winning. There's an API that you can submit SQL queries to get the data.
Wow.
Yeah, I was really impressed with what New South Wales has in terms of access. In terms of visualization and presentation, well, okay, they don't have all of the interactive graphs and everything else. And to be fair, Victoria does have the data available, but they're CSV downloads.
I think,
yeah, go ahead.
Having a look at that API, I think, is the next step. That sounds awesome.
Well, I was going to look at just the different data availability, and if I have this YouTube video and say, hey, Department of Health, I'd really like not just age of people when they got tested and if they tested positive, but I'd like to see age cross vaccine status, because then I'd like to start making predictions. I'd like to start building Sankey diagrams of, right, if I have 1,700 cases today and they're distributed like this, hypothetically, this is my forecast.
Yeah.
But if I have 1,700 cases a day of young people that are all vaccinated versus 1,700 cases a day of old people which aren't vaccinated, I get very different outcomes.
No, very true. Very true. I think that's I'm very impressed to have an API at all, to be honest. I think that's what we could probably jump into next for the next time we do this. But let's kind of play with it and see if we can pull something out. Could be a bit of fun. It's always a good
it's an API, but I didn't find the most documentation in terms of what all the field names are and what. And I know there are ways to get descriptions of all the tables and to get the schema using SQL, but I forget what they are.
Everyone does.
It's something to Google. But I'll send you I'll send you, Jahan, not you, YouTube community, the API. But a little Google foo should be able to find it for you.
That's good. That's good.
But it's odd in Victoria because in lockdown 2, the problem was it got into aged care. And so we recorded 800 deaths pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Whereas this lockdown, it's largely stayed out of aged care. And even when it has, we have vaccines. So even that comparison
Totally changes it.
of we're having so many more cases, but so fewer deaths.
Which is why thus you want the breakdown, which explains away a lot of this stuff. Yeah,
Right.
Absolutely.
Because otherwise it just looks funny. Like we had a couple hundred cases a day, but we had 800 deaths, and now we have 2,000 cases a day and no deaths. Like what's happening? Well, what's happening is we have vaccines, and because the age distribution is different.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen that just written and explained with visualizations and interactions and whatever.
You're a true analyst, though. I think you're expecting the kind of thing a colleague would in the information a colleague would provide you with, rather than a news reporter who, they're chasing the latest, brightest story, looking for simple things. Digging deep is not, and hard to sell. So the politicians won't give it either. So that's just.
Yeah, but it's quite hard when all the data come in different formats.
Yeah, they could definitely.
If I'm looking at Victoria data, it comes in one way, New South Wales data comes in another way. I haven't looked at the other states because they don't have as many cases. I don't know about ACT, but just fewer people. So sorry, Canberrans.
Exactly. I think I was thinking of wrapping up just so we're concluding, and I think the conclusions we came to are pretty valid, in that there's more information here that we could really use to understand what's going on and have a better picture of what's happening, and then have a better way of tracking where we're going.
That's right.
And then I think there's an element where the numbers people do their bit, and then they give it to the people, and I think that's a bad way to view the world. I think it should be, we should have the analysts working together to solve that problem and share it with the world, so that we can all interact with it, and then politicians can comment on it, rather than being the main people that are bringing that to the world, because I don't think it's too much of a burden to put on them. They've got to figure out what to do as well. So let's let everyone have access to that information. They can then comment on it and then make decisions. So I think the model we have right now is wrong.
Hang on, not the prediction models,
no,
but the model in terms
working
of communication.
Yes.
I hate it when it's like the model we have is wrong. I mean, like, do you mean Doherty? Oh no, you mean the communication model, not the mathematical model.
It's not significantly wrong. There we go. I hate when people say instead of substantially, they say significantly, and I get confused as well with my.
Yes, but is it useful?
There you go.
But yeah, thanks so much for your time. I guess next week, do you want to try to do Thursday again?
I think bi-weekly might be, or fortnightly might be easier.
Fortnightly, all right. Yeah, that's good. Because we said we'd be on last weekend. We weren't on last weekend. Our prediction didn't match our reality for what life was going to do to us.
But at least we're tracking it.
Yeah. All right. So fortnightly. Thursday around 7, 8.
Sounds good.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Tune in, everybody.
Thank you all. Have a good night. And